The race hadn't even settled into a rhythm yet. George Russell had just blasted down the main straight in Melbourne, electrical power surging through the new 2026 power unit, reclaiming the lead yet again. Behind him, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton were locked in a strange, almost surreal battle of energy management, cars gaining and losing hundreds of horsepower within the same lap. 7 lead changes in 9 laps. Formula One's new era had arrived and nobody quite knew how to control it yet. Then, on lap 12, the race slowed. A virtual safety car. For every strategist on the pit wall, that moment meant one thing: a free pit stop. Mercedes saw it instantly. McLaren reacted. The entire grid moved. Ferrari didn't. Lewis Hamilton saw the mistake the second it happened. He said it on the radio. And within the next 14 laps, a race Ferrari had under control slipped completely out of their hands. From the outside, the decisive moment of the 2026 Australian Grand Prix looked small. There was no crash, no dramatic overtake, no mechanical failure, just a virtual safety car deployed on lap 12. But in modern Formula One, especially under the 2026 regulations, those moments carry enormous strategic weight. A virtual safety car reduces the pace of the entire field by roughly 30%, which means the time lost in the pit lane shrinks dramatically. A pit stop that normally costs around 22 seconds suddenly costs much less. To a strategist, that's not just an opportunity, it's a gift. The virtual safety car was triggered when Isaac Hadjar's Red Bull stopped near turn 9, smoke spilling from the power unit. The field slowed instantly as the delta time appeared on steering wheels across the grid. Within seconds, pit walls started moving. Mercedes reacted first. George Russell, who had started the race on pole by 0.8 of a second, was called in immediately. Behind him, rookie teammate Kimi Antonelli followed, the team executing a perfectly coordinated double stack. Both Mercedes cars switched to the hard compound, positioning themselves for a long controlled stint. McLaren reacted as well. Lando Norris boxed. Across the pit lane, engineers were doing the same mental calculation. Fresh tires now, reduced time loss, strategic flexibility later. Ferrari looked at the same situation and chose something different. Charles Leclerc stayed on track in first place. Lewis Hamilton stayed out in third. On paper, the reasoning made sense. Ferrari believed there was a strong probability another neutralization would occur later in the race. If that happened, they could pit under an even more advantageous moment while keeping track position now. It was a gamble. But the problem wasn't the gamble itself, it was the timing. Seconds after the virtual safety car ended and racing resumed, Hamilton's voice cut through the radio channel. Not uncertain, not emotional, just analytical. At least one of us should have come in. Inside the cockpit, the 7-time world champion had already read the race, and Ferrari's pit wall had already made its decision. But that radio message revealed something deeper than a missed pit stop. It showed that the driver inside the car had already seen the mistake forming, and that was only the beginning of the problem. To understand how quickly Ferrari lost control of the race, you have to look at the numbers. Because Formula One strategy is rarely about dramatic moments, it's about math. When the second virtual safety car ended on lap 19, Charles Leclerc was still leading the race on paper. Ferrari's gamble appeared to have survived the first phase of the race, but the numbers were already telling a different story. George Russell, now running on fresh hard tires after his earlier stop, was 5.2 seconds behind the Ferrari. That gap might sound comfortable. In Formula One terms, it isn't, especially when the pace difference is significant. Russell's Mercedes was lapping roughly 3/4 of a second faster per lap than Leclerc. That's an enormous performance advantage in modern Formula One, where margins are typically measured in tenths. Do the calculation. A 5-second gap with a 0.75-second advantage per lap disappears quickly. At that rate, Russell would catch the Ferrari in roughly 7 laps, and once the gap closed, Leclerc's older tires would offer almost no defense. Meanwhile, the Ferrari pit wall was facing another strategic complication. Lewis Hamilton was still circulating on the same original tires, trying to manage the situation from inside the cockpit. On lap 20, he keyed the radio again. "My tires are still okay, do not box me at the same time." The message wasn't about tire wear, it was about strategy. Hamilton was asking Ferrari to split their approach. Pit one car, leave the other on track. Create two different race scenarios instead of committing both drivers to the same strategy. It's one of the oldest strategic tools in Formula One. Two cars, two different plans, two chances to win. But Ferrari didn't take that option. Instead, they held both drivers on the same trajectory, waiting for a moment that had already passed. And every lap that passed brought Russell closer. The shrinking gap wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Lap 21, lap 22, lap 23. Each time Leclerc crossed the line, the number on the timing screen dropped. 5.2 seconds, 4.5 seconds, 3.7 seconds. By lap 25, Russell's Mercedes was already sitting directly behind the Ferrari. At that point, the race was no longer strategic. It was inevitable. And Ferrari's earlier decision had quietly transformed the entire competitive balance of the Grand Prix. Part of what made the opening phase of the 2026 Australian Grand Prix so chaotic was the technology itself. The new regulations fundamentally changed how Formula One cars produce power. Under the previous rules, the internal combustion engine remained the dominant force. Electrical energy supplemented performance but rarely defined it. The 2026 power unit flipped that balance. Power output is now split almost 50-50 between the combustion engine and electrical systems. The MGUK alone now produces 350 kilowatts of electrical power, roughly triple its previous capacity. That shift created a completely new dynamic on track. Energy deployment became just as important as raw engine performance. But the battery has limits. Once the stored energy drains, drivers encounter what engineers call super clipping. At that point, the car suddenly loses significant electrical assistance, sometimes dropping hundreds of horsepower mid-straight. The effect can look bizarre from the outside. One car appears to surge forward with overwhelming acceleration, only to become vulnerable seconds later when the battery depletes. That's exactly what happened during the first 9 laps in Melbourne. Russell would deploy his electrical advantage down the main straight, blasting past Charles Leclerc. But once the energy ran low, the Ferrari could immediately fight back through the corners and into the next straight. The lead changed hands repeatedly, 7 times in 9 laps. Not because of mistakes, not because of crashes, but because drivers were constantly managing an energy budget. It was almost like watching 2 chess players move pieces across a board at 200 kilometers per hour. Each driver had to decide when to attack, when to defend, and when to conserve electrical power for the next lap. Lewis Hamilton, starting from 7th on the grid, quickly climbed into 3rd position, inserting himself into the same strategic battle. Behind the leaders, Kimi Antonelli recovered from his own deployment issues to reach 4th place, keeping 4 cars within striking distance. For spectators, it was fascinating. For strategists, it was chaos. Because in a race defined by fluctuating electrical energy, tire strategy becomes even more important. Fresh tires provide grip and stability while drivers manage the complex energy systems, which is exactly why the Lap 12 virtual safety car carried so much strategic weight. It offered teams the chance to reset the race. Mercedes took it, Ferrari didn't. And that decision quietly shifted the technical balance of the entire Grand Prix. One of the most fascinating parts of the Melbourne race wasn't the strategy itself. It was the contrast between what the drivers could see and what the pit wall decided. Inside the cockpit, Lewis Hamilton was reading the race in real time. Drivers have access to enormous amounts of information during a Grand Prix. Tire temperatures, battery levels, sector times, delta gaps, deployment modes, all of it flows through the steering wheel display. But drivers also rely on instinct. After 17 seasons in Formula One and 7 world championships, Hamilton has developed an extraordinary ability to sense when a race is about to shift. That instinct triggered on lap 12. He watched both Mercedes cars dive into the pit lane under the virtual safety car. He saw the opportunity, and he understood the risk of ignoring it. His radio message was calm but unmistakable. "At least one of us should have come in." That sentence carried an important nuance. Hamilton wasn't demanding that Ferrari pit both cars. He simply wanted one of them to cover the Mercedes strategy. It's a classic defensive move. If the rival team gains an advantage from the pit stop, at least one Ferrari remains positioned to respond, but that option disappeared when Ferrari chose to keep both drivers out. Hamilton continued racing, climbing through the early chaos of the race, but the strategic tension was already building. Then, the second virtual safety car arrived on lap 19. It was triggered when Valtteri Bottas's Cadillac stopped near the pit entry, forcing marshals to recover the car. Ironically, this was the exact scenario Ferrari had anticipated. A second neutralization, another chance to pit, but the car had stopped too close to the pit entry, forcing race control to close the pit lane. Suddenly, the gamble collapsed. The opportunity Ferrari had waited for existed, but they couldn't use it. From inside the Ferrari cockpit, Hamilton understood the consequences instantly. When Russell began closing the gap later in the race, Hamilton's voice returned on the radio again. How are they only 10 seconds? It wasn't frustration, it was disbelief, because he knew exactly how the race had slipped away.